What is feminism? Are men allowed to even talk about feminism? Am I allowed to be a feminist? I think so. Is there something unique about modern feminism, something unique about this period that conditions the way we think about women and men and our relationship and equality generally? This is Ralph. Ralph is really interested in feminism. Obviously, Ralph is a guy. So what kind of misogynistic or negative views might he have? What kind of sexist views might Ralph have that we might want to challenge under the banner of feminism? Careful. Don't jump too high, man. Today I want to talk about feminism in the age of Trump. I know you're sick of hearing about Trump. I'm sick of hearing about Trump. But there's something about him that embodies so much of the sexist, misogynistic view that we need to talk about this. And I want to talk about how we might be able to challenge these views. I want to talk about Mary Wollstonecraft and bell hooks as examples of philosophies that might help us give us a vocabulary or a way of thinking about things that can challenge these views. 2016 was a watershed moment for me when the Access Hollywood tape came out regarding Trump. You know all this. Trump grabbing women and bragging about women being these sexual objects that he just kisses. He doesn't wait to actually talk to them. He's this aggressor. And this larger capitalist view, this larger business-esque view, this larger stereotypical masculinity, which is largely incorrect, of just being this predator, of being aggressive, going on. He applies that, of course, to sexuality, and many people just think that's normal. Locker talk. That boys will be boys. When I heard this, first of all, I knew in my own experiences that was incorrect. Most men are not like this. I hope most men. But my experiences of being a male with other males was not as he described it. I, of course, know of a certain percentage of males who are like that talk like that view other people, not just women, but just other men as less than, right? You're not as human as me. I'm more important because I have more money, or I'm more important because I have a title or a suit. So, of course, we know of these things, but he's wrong on so many levels, and yet he won the election. So the Access Hollywood tape comes out. The whole world sees him for who he is. But more than that, there were a number of public appearances and audio tapes and recordings of him saying similar things. And yet he still won. And he won against a woman. Now, technically, he lost the popular vote. So in my view, he didn't win. Weird electoral college in the US. But still, millions and millions and millions of people agreed with him. And women, too, agreed with him. That's just boys will be boys. That's locker talk. No, that's systematic dehumanization. And if you normalize that as locker talk, as boys will be boys, you not only permit it, you perpetuate it. And that's not the kind of world we want to live in, where certain people can be a certain thing and women can just be pretty things. So we'll talk about that. I feel bad calling anybody a sexist, misogynist, and I've never met Trump. These are my personal evaluations, and if I'm wrong, if I'm missing something, please post in the comments. Still, as it sits, his normalized behavior is troubling. The Associated Press story came out 20 different people on its previous show, The Apprentice. 20 different employees, I believe. They were employees. Described his behavior as lewd and inappropriate. Trump has a strong track record of criticizing women for how they look. CNN aired a segment in which they looked at multiple interviews Trump gave on the Howard Stern show. Then they talked about, basically he was saying similar things to the Access Hollywood tape, having power over women and control over women in different ways. In 2004, September 2004, Trump commented on his own daughter's Ivanka, her body. I'm going to use some colorful language now. Quote, he can call his daughter, quote, a piece of ass, end quote. Ugh. Vomitous, right? Just What? We need to be careful now. On the one hand, sexuality is a very powerful force, and it's natural and it's good, and it's all part of the human equation. Like, sexuality is a part of what we are. The argument, however, is that that is all you are allowed to be. You're only allowed to be this form of sexuality, and it's a culturally appropriate form of sexuality. So one culture might prize large breast size. So in 2018, 300,000 women in the US had breast augmentation surgery, enlargement, I think. There are many medical reasons for doing this as well, cancer and whatnot. But the concern is that women have been taught this is how you ought to look. And when the then candidate, but now president, looks at his own daughter's body and does that, it's not necessarily that he's saying he finds her personally sexually attractive and he wants to be with her. That's, perversion of all kinds of, well, that's a whole different level of perversion. But it's compartmentalizing or allowing her to be a certain kind of thing. And a phrase here or a phrase there, we need to be very careful. I've never met him. I don't know him. These are only suggestive phrases. So it's far from a conclusive case now that this guy is just this terrible human being that I'm going to make him out to be, or sounds like I'm making him out to be. In fact, we need to be careful. Bell Hooks is going to recognize, and I think rightly so, that in making another person the enemy, we only perpetuate the problem. So I'm not making Trump an enemy now. I'm trying to understand how all of these public disclosures of his views of women, how that didn't prevent him from getting into the White House. His daughter, several former Miss USA and Miss Teen USA beauty pageant contestants accused him of coming in a number of times while they were undressing. Men are not allowed in the back while women are getting ready to go into these contests. He, of course, was the owner of the Miss Universe franchise. So the accusations are from 1997 and then to 2000, 2001, and then 2006. He would just go back and just drop in on these women without asking permission, obviously. And of course, it would be surprising to them because privacy and respect are expected. That's just the standard. That's the norm. But he was able to get away with it, he argues, on a 2005 interview on the Howard Stern show, quote, that he could get away with it, quote, get away with things like that, end quote. Why? Because he owned the pageant. He owned the pageant, so he owned the girls, right? Sure. And he found it exciting to just go back and be this powerful man who can just walk into a room that no other man can and just ogle women. Because that's power, that's virtue. No, virtuous men, no, that's not virtue. That's victimization of women. That's dehumanization. That's to take people's basic rights of privacy away. That's sexist. And he's admitting it flat out. If the Hollywood Access tape wasn't enough, the Howard Stern interviews aren't enough. Look at how he treats other people, not just women, but anybody who's not rich and who's not powerful. And you begin to develop this larger view that is perpetuated, as Wollstonecraft and Hooks will contest or agree with, in a capitalist, patriarchal society, right, where men's values reign. And it's a certain kind of capitalist as exploitation. Okay. Of course, we have the Me Too movement that asks us to rethink and revalue what's going on in the world right now, which is amazing. Anything that gets us to ask these questions is good. Even if we don't agree, whatever movement you might be thinking of right now that you might not fully agree with, it has different tactics and maybe you don't agree with, it's that questioning of ideas, because gender is not a scientific compartment alone. Saying man, woman, other is just a matter of your chromosome, right? Your XY, your YY, XY. You know what I'm saying? That's one expression, an objective scientific description of what you are as whatever I don't even know, DNA, I don't know how big the DNA is or the strands are. It's just a minimalist way of thinking about human beings. I'm more than my DNA. DNA is important, but I'm more than my DNA. I have social categories and social ideas. What we say about men and women often have to do with gender as an interpretive thing in terms of power. You are allowed to be powerful this way. You are allowed to be powerful that way. For men, you're allowed to be powerful in that traditional masculine, right, of conquering, of being aggressive, talking over people and taking what you want. Stereotypical how we see Trump treating women. And women, you're allowed to be powerful. Women, how are you allowed to be powerful? Obviously, sexuality is a part of all of us, and you're allowed to be powerful in terms of sexuality, but how else? Wollstonecraft, writing, she was born 1759, died 1779. She's writing a long time ago, says that women are allowed to be powerful in just a couple of very limited ways. You're allowed to be pretty. You're allowed to be beautiful, but you're not allowed to be a thinker. You're not allowed to be a great thinker. You're not allowed to question. You're not allowed to stand outside the norm. You can be a mother. You can be a wife. You can raise children. You're a domesticated creature. We're going to talk about a bird in a cage for Wollstonecraft. Wollstonecraft existed as a sort of a prototypical feminist. She's not a feminist in the traditional sense, and the word didn't exist then. She argues that men and women are equal before the law. She argues that men and women are equal before God. They're not equal before the law in this time. Women are not allowed to be, they're not being partners, they're not being companions. They're very limited in what they can do. They're certainly not being educated in the same way. And Wollstonecraft comes along and goes, hey, whoa. People keep complaining that women are not as good as men in many ways because their emotions are out of whack, they lack discipline, they're not rational. And she says, well, if you educated them the same way as you do men, you would see that it's not biology that's preventing women from being powerful, however that might manifest itself, but it's these stereotypes and this lack of opportunity. Women who live lives with doors being closed all around them by society, by culture, and even doors closed themselves. So many women, she will argue, close these doors themselves because they've been trained by culture to resist the freedom. Of course they're going to look less than men, right? Of course they're going to look less educated when they're less educated, less rational when they've not been, and so on. Of course. The Vindication of the Rights of Women, her text, 1792, became quite popular. Vindication of the Rights of Women. She argues that women are not naturally inferior to men, but appear that way because they lack education. So if we fix that, we can begin to fix other things too, but education is certainly one of the first places to begin. During her time, women existed to serve men, to serve children, to serve culture, but not to be partners. They were basically servants or slaves. And when I imagine Trump barging into these back rooms with young women, I tell you, if my daughter, if I had a daughter and she was one of those women and I heard about the pervert, it wouldn't matter if he was a president or whatever else, there would be a conversation happening at a very high level. Ugh, they're repugnant. Anyway, I'm trying to envision this, and as I see it, he's making them servants to his sexual pleasure. Right? He's making them unwittingly. In Wollstonecraft's case, she's arguing that women have wittingly, so not wittingly, but they've sort of given into culture. Okay, fine, yes, we've been this way our whole lives, I guess. What's the point in resisting? In this case, the women know better that he shouldn't be doing that, but they have no power to stop him because he owns it. So it's a perpetual victimization in a different context with different things going on, of course, but still the basics are there. Women, you are allowed to be pretty, and we're going to use you for your attractiveness, your sexuality, and we're not going to give you equal rights. We're not going to see you as a human being to be talked with like any other human being, not even basic privacy rights. Maybe Trump is the exception that proves the rule. Maybe the vast majority of people are better than that. I hope they are. I believe they are. But the millions that voted for him and kept him in office, keep me up at night. So there are three things that I want to take away from Wollstonecraft. First, this idea of women's equality and what causes inequality. What does it mean to be equal? Again, she's arguing, in her case, she's not arguing necessarily that men and women are going to be the same, but there's that sense of give them more equality, especially education, and you will see that the larger issues of society maybe aren't as bad. As an example, if women are raising children and women are educated, well, you're just perpetuating a harder time later on, right? The children aren't going to be as educated. So educate women, and they're going to be educating children. It's a win-win for culture. Everybody wins. 2, critiques of conventional femininity. This is outside my wheelhouse. I'm a guy. I really shouldn't be talking about femininity. I'm not really sure even what masculinity means. It's a fluid thing, but you can try and work it out. A healthy masculinity, a healthy femininity. Wollstonecraft says traditional femininity is quirky, is problematic, so we need to address that. And if culture is to be better, we need to be better, more human potential. I think that's the third thing I take away from this. Wollstonecraft is simply saying that the range of human possibility for women has been unfairly restricted. I mean, possibility is just the infinite variety of things that you can do and the forms of strength and the forms of power. I'm speaking to women now, that you can manifest. When people compartmentalize that or train you to think those possibilities don't exist, they're dehumanizing you, and we need to fix that. Now, so think about equality, inequality, critiques of femininity, and just human possibility in general. When women are treated as beautiful objects, they're objectified, they become commodities to be owned and used. Her argument is that culture at large suffers, and its morality is an example. You can say that's kind of a corrupt morality, obviously. So what is a woman? We need to be careful. If we try to define woman as this, then we begin to compartmentalize, right? We begin to narrow the possibilities. So I'm not going to say this is what a woman is, this is what femininity is. I'm going to focus on a critique of many of the dominant forms of femininity and see what you think. Hundreds of years ago in her culture, still happening here, that women are allowed to be seen, not heard. For Mary, reason, she's religious, she's a Christian, and she believes that God has given us all reason, and that is what makes us equal, that we all have this opportunity to think a certain way. And I think it's very powerful, and often her religious views are not really discussed as much. It could be troubling for different reasons, challenging. But this is her main reason for saying that everyone is equal. God has made us equal. Not culture. Clearly culture has not made us equal. Clearly that patriarchal, capitalist, misogynistic culture has not made us equal. But God now, the Christian God, at least for her, has made us equal. And so, not biology that makes women inferior and passive. These are two qualities. Women are kind of inferior and passive. Not biology now, but it's culture that changes women. Culture, the values, and that includes both men and women. Both men and women are responsible, I would argue largely men, of course, for this dehumanization. One of the standard criticisms of women taking office, women in politics, women out in public, basically outside of the home. One of the standard criticisms is that women can't control their emotions. They're just too easily jostled about. They fly off the handle. And she talks about this in terms of an excess of emotional responsiveness, sensitivity. Well, here's a quote. A gust of feeling, end quote. This is a phrase. A gust of feeling that makes women sort of contradictory or not trustworthy. They're unreliable. You don't want a woman to be a jet fighter, because you get a woman up there in the jet fighter and she's got all kinds of bombs, and then she has this emotional outburst. She might just start killing people. Heaven forbid. That might sound silly, but there's something to this. Consider, in her culture, women and men have been separated, largely separated, and these rational, disciplined men, stereotype, rational, disciplined men are said to have more virtue, better character. And her response is, well, if you had educated both men and women equally, then they would have equal opportunity to express the virtue, to learn to control their emotions, and to be rational. And I'm not suggesting these are virtues, that we should sort of subdue emotion or something like that. Traditionally, philosophers have argued that that's sort of the first part of being human, learning to control your emotion, right? Learn to control your emotion a little bit so that you're not out of control, you're not going to harm yourself or other people. Men, if they had been raised like women without an education, shouldn't be jet fighter pilots either. It's not to say we're the same. It's not to say men and women are exactly the same, but it's to say if we had pushed for greater equality in terms of education, we would have a greater equal result. Stop blaming women, calling them naturally contradictory in emotion, calling them out of control, when you as a society are largely responsible for these negative outcomes. Quote, this is an interesting quote, taught from their infancy that beauty is women's scepter power, the mind shapes itself to the body, and roaming around its guilt cage only seeks to adorn its prison, end quote. Why, I think about this. Taught from their infancy, when the moment you're born, you're taught that beauty is your power. Beauty is your power. Men get into this too, where muscles are our power, or having cars. There's an external appearance is your power. The mind then shapes itself to the body. Your personality becomes your outward appearance. I'm good, I'm valued because I'm turning people on. I'm good, I'm valued because people want to see me. Ugh. Well, I can only tell you from my own perspective that that's true. Obviously, I'm like Fabio or Sorsager. No. I lost 30 pounds once. I was working at it, working really hard, and people really noticed, and there were like a lot of compliments. Or consider you dressing up for a prom and you put a suit on. It was weird to me that suddenly my mother saying how handsome I look, and my wife, oh, you look so good, because of how I looked. That's an odd thing from a man. That's not how I live my life, obviously. So these moments in which people are paying attention to my appearance, I notice them. I can only hypothesize then what it would be to live my whole life as eye candy. Is that even a right? Is this to be my worth is based on how people see me? I don't spend money on hair care products for obvious reasons. I don't spend $300 on cosmetics for obvious reasons. I don't spend $400 on shoes because that's insane. But we have these industries now built on people, to use her words, seeking to adorn their prison, their beauty prison. Again, we need to be respectful. You've worked hard to get a law degree, beauty. So many different ways of thinking about it. That's the problem. So one more time. Taught from their infancy that beauty is women's power, scepter. The mind shapes itself to the body. You become what other people see. Rousseau talks about this in terms of self-love and love of self. I am me through your eyes. So I'm me through your eyes. Is that how I want to live? Constantly seeking approval, constantly seeking attention from other people to validate me. Now, I would argue that that's inevitable. We all need some sort of affirmation from other people, whether it's our parents or employees, employers, something like that. We're in a relationship with people. But again, the argument, but if that's all you're allowing in, if that's the maximum of what you are in a guilt cage. And she's going to argue women actually begin to enjoy it. Ooh. Think about it for a moment. Maybe you or you know of somebody who enjoys their inferiority. Mary's arguing that many women enjoy their inferiority and they despise their freedom. Possible freedom. Again, in a culture where they don't really have a lot of freedom, she herself is realizing or manifesting a certain freedom that was uncommon, right? She's writing, speaking up, standing up, becoming known for having different views. So she's realizing a kind of freedom that is at least theoretically possible for some. Do women in culture today enjoy their inferiority? And if they do we care? If they do, should we do anything about it? Am I in a position to tell people you should not enjoy your inferiority? That's delicate. That's a tricky thing. If you want to be a sex slave to a rich man, am I really in a position to tell you otherwise? At a cultural level, we could argue that we should set up different ideals for women and at least leave it as an open possibility to have other things. And as a culture now, if we all insisted on women being sex slaves to rich men, that's definitely a problem. We're limiting the range of possibility. So anyway, at least she's arguing at least that some women in her culture enjoy their inferiority, even pushing back against their own natural right to think, preferring instead to be, I would say, a pseudo beauty pageant queen. I say a pseudo beauty pageant queen because a real queen would have power. 300,000 some women in 2018 had augmentative breast surgery to enlarge their breasts. What does that, is that a normal kind of preening that's necessary to life? I'm all for people having some sense of power, right? Gaining freedom and opportunity in life. But, and I can't answer this question, but how much of those surgeries are simply people giving into, this is the male, specifically in this culture, a male version of sexuality. Not only do we expect you to spend a fortune on cosmetics and hair care and everything else, now we expect you to actually physically augment your body so that you can have the only power we're letting you have. And again, I can't answer that question, but it's only suggestive. And then you look at someone like Trump, and you look at the people who support him, and you realize that in fact, one of the dominant roles for women in our culture remains one of being in this guilt cage, of being maintained as something to be seen. I think, for me at least, what kind of encapsulates this conversation is, are women today voluntarily surrendering themselves, part of themselves? Are they voluntarily surrendering part of themselves? Are women being forced to surrender part of themselves? Being forced. It's one thing to voluntarily give some, and I don't know that. You spend 30 years of your life being told you need to be pretty. Are you really then making a free choice to go out and get augmentative surgery? I like this metaphor. Wollstonecraft argues that women are like military men. They're good when they're obedient and they're valued for how they look. They're not individual people. To be a part of the military means surrendering identity, surrendering individuality to be a part of this herd, but it's for a greater purpose, obviously. She argues that women have been basically militarized. I would say they've been militarized into something like the phrase sex sells, right? It's this great grand mechanism of advertising to try to get us to buy things using sexuality, parading women in front of us with no names. Are you being disciplined into a sexual soldier to serve the interests of men? And from your serving of the interests of men, you get a marginal reward, you shelter, protection, or you might get a lavish reward. Maybe you find a millionaire and he's able to support you in a wonderful fashion. Have you still, at the end of the day, been sexually militarized into a kind of being that surrenders the fullness of you, right? The other beauty. Femininity, feminism, as with masculinity, is a question of thinking about what makes us beautiful, what makes us fuller human beings, flourishing human beings. We could ask questions like, how many movies have you seen, princess movies from Walt Disney? Even they recognize, and they've done parodies, they've done movies about their movies showing how, they've sort of had this lopsided view of what it means to be a woman. Are there obstacles for you today that prevent you from being more? Feminism, for women now, wants to help overcome those. Are you like a bird, trapped in a cage? A gilded cage, covered in gold perhaps, but a cage nonetheless. spending every day preening yourself, not because it makes you happier necessarily or because it makes you more full as a human being, but it's to meet the conditions of your owner, like a pet. This would apply not just to women, of course, but to men as well. Regardless of gender, this is a possibility. And if we look around the world, we can see different cultures where there is a much more glaring sense that this is in fact the case. In a liberal culture such as our own, we tend to think that these things can't possibly be happening or these things aren't happening. But I think that assumption is largely misplaced. And so modern feminism has to contend with that sense that while women have been made equal before the law, women, the very idea of gender, the gender roles of women, haven't been given equal power, haven't been given equal say, haven't been given equal expression of what it means to be a human being. And that's troubling, very troubling. Quote, I invite them to assist to emancipate their companion, to make her a helpmeet for them. Would men but generously snap our chains and be content with rational fellowship instead of slavish obedience? They would find us more observant daughters, more affectionate sisters, more faithful wives, more reasonable mothers, in a word, better citizens. End quote. Again, Wollstonecraft. Interesting. Seek out a companion. Would men not want a rational form of relationship rather than slavish obedience? That's a very difficult question because some men, such as Trump, seem to exemplify the desire for slavish obedience out of others, sort of a mafia king, right? The argument here is better wives, better sisters, better mothers, better society when we're more equal. My boys are too young, but soon I expect, in the next few years, I expect to be having conversations about the gender role differences among us. We've already seen some of these play out. Expectations that the boys have that daddy will do this and mommy will do that. And we have to be careful that they don't become entrenched, that these are just expectations that men act this way and women act that way. I made the mistake. We were watching a movie and I can't recall the exact phrasing, but I said something to the effect of, oh, he's crying like a little girl. He's crying like a little girl. And as the words were coming out of my mouth, I knew that I was doing a stereotype, a gender stereotype. Of course, my wife is sitting beside me and she jumped all over it. So I had to pretend like I wasn't making a huge mistake, even though, what do you mean crying like a little girl? Why not crying like a little boy? And why was I looking at a male character? And I don't even know why I was saying, I can't remember the context fully. But it was just a slip of the tongue. It was just one of those things that you realize the gender stereotypes are there, and it's so easy to impress those on your children just by saying them. So we've already been working hard to challenge those and to make sure that we're challenging our own ideas, just to be careful that we don't, again, put people in that gilded cage or that guilt cage, as nice as it may seem covered in gold. I expect to be saying to my boys sometime soon that to be equal doesn't mean to be the same. To be equal doesn't mean to be the same. We may be equal before the law, which is an abstract concept, but to be equal means to give everyone the fair opportunity to be themselves, to create themselves, to be what they want to be, without again putting them in that gilded cage. Equal doesn't mean same. Expect people to be acting differently. That's okay. Realize, of course, that not all men are equal to other men. Of course, women have traditionally been the target of that patriarchal society to limit their possibilities. But men too, visible minorities, the wrong color, the wrong class, the wrong economic group, and you will suffer that sense of inequality as well. We will spend our entire lives as human beings seeing other human beings as sexual interests. That's fine. But again, when we make that the dominant conversation in an oversexed culture, it becomes a very strange thing. Imagine now if instead of women, I was talking constantly about marshmallows, and I would have contests for beauty pageant contests for marshmallows, and I had pictures of marshmallows in my wallet, and there was marshmallow porn freely available to everybody, and I'm constantly looking at marshmallows, and when I see a marshmallow, all I see is it's just weird that we're so obsessed in that way. We shouldn't let that be the dominant conversation. And by the way, I have nothing against marshmallows. Marshmallows are cool. Unless you're diabetic, and that's not cool. Don't let your sexual desires limit others. Don't let your perception of gender roles limit others. When you see a woman, you see a man or other, that's not them. Those titles aren't them. There's so much more. Sexuality is an art craft developed carefully, playfully. Don't let culture monopolize yours. Don't let the dominant opinion monopolize how sexuality should be interpreted and expressed, and how gender should be created and valued. Guard yourself from becoming a force for encouraging anything that might resemble the dehumanization of the other, and by extension, culture. When you find yourself saying something like crying like a little girl, ask yourself why you said that. What does that mean? Maybe explain it a little bit better, if at all. Certainly, when you find yourself walking into a locker room and having boy talk about women that is openly dehumanizing, I would hope you'd hold yourself to account and question yourself that that's not, at least it shouldn't be, the norm, and that it's not okay to pull other people down by making them these objects for your whim. Expect more of yourself and others. It's okay to raise the bar. So many people, like Trump, keep lowering the bar over and over. We can't let that become normal. We can't normalize that lowering of the bar. And finally, look for the infinite possibility in others, merely in the appearance of others. Appearances can be deceiving. We're looking for depth. We're looking for connection. We're looking for relationality. We're not looking for using people like utility for some kind of end. Again, question yourself, hold yourself in check. Let's talk about Bell Hooks, specifically her work, Feminist Theory, From Margin to Center, 1984. Bell Hooks she surprised me. Her ideas are quite surprising. I find that she's probably challenged me the most to rethink my values and norms. And she helps me conceive of feminism in a much larger context of what I'm more familiar with, which is capitalism. Again, I'm a bit outside of my wheelhouse, talking about women's experiences of inequality as a man. But she helps me envision ways in which I might become a feminist and deal with the biases and assumptions that I have in terms of capitalism in a patriarchal society. So she's quite interested in the white capitalist patriarchy. White, obviously, the color of those people who have traditionally been in power. Capitalist being the idea that the system of money that we have relies on the exploitation of certain people so that others can make money. It's not a fair system, it's not an equal system, in other words, it's an unfair leveraging. And then that patriarchal side, where men have been the dominant sayers of what is true, what has value, and what doesn't. So she's looking at these white capitalist patriarchal societies and she's going, this is how feminism has fit in, and this is how feminism has actually encouraged some of these issues, as well as challenged them. And that's very interesting. Quote, "Feminism is a movement to end sexism, sexist exploitation, and oppression." Okay, so I think most of us have that general idea. Feminism is a movement to end sexism, saying that some people have power and others don't based on their gender. Sexist exploitation, so I've been emphasizing that quite a bit, the idea that you're using somebody, you're exploiting their sexuality for your gain. It's not an equal partnership, it's not a relationship in which both partners gain. It's Trump walking into the back room, something like that. These little, I gotta get that out of my head, gross. And then oppression. You could argue that all of these different themes are oppressive in some way, but here you see sort of an evolution from ending sexism, sexual exploitation of all forms, and then oppression generally. And so oppression is a very big umbrella term for all kinds of ways in which human beings treat one another unfairly, poorly, whatever. Now, I should say up front that I was raised by my mother, principally, and my mother for years, worked very menial jobs, working in a hotel, cleaning up after guests, working in old age home care facilities, where she was the lowest on the tier of employment. So these were not glamorous jobs by any means, but she provided for her children, and we never went hungry. There were a number of years where we were quite poor, so I remember poverty quite well, but she always managed to make it work. So when I think of a woman, obviously I'm thinking of sort of the example of my mother. I think of someone quite strong, who always took care of her children, regardless. And I can't imagine doing some of these jobs now. So in my mind, a woman has quite a high ranking, very important. Why then do we as a culture systematically discriminate against women based on not only their skin color, not only their gender, but their economic class? If my mother, who's white, had been black, or if my mother had been Hispanic or something, our lives probably would have been much harder. I'm only guessing, of course, but that's the running story for society. It's not just your gender. Then you have to worry about whether you're the right color of skin or whether you're the right economic class. Mainstream feminism has largely been, according to Hooks, a matter of what white middle-class women have engaged in. They had the time, white middle-class women, to go out and protest. Black, poor neighborhoods, maybe someone like my mother who was economically disadvantaged, they were already working outside the home and working nonstop. They had neither the money nor the time to go and protest for women's rights, which meant that the voices that were heard, according to Hooks, for mainstream feminism were voices that were already fairly well established, already had some money, but wanted or had a certain vision of what feminism should look like. And when that vision was realized, all the other women who couldn't participate anyway, all the other women who were already working next to no money, even though they were working full time, they were pushed to the margins even more. And if that's true, then mainstream feminism has led to greater inequality in many respects. Well, that's an interesting argument. Could that be the case? Hooks calls into question the history of mainstream feminism and asks, could it have been done differently? Could it have been done better? And what should we do now? And clearly she thinks it could have been done better, if only because it failed to answer the question of equality. We say, or they say, the general consensus is that feminism is supposed to strive towards equality. But what does equality mean? And does it mean equality with men? That seems to be the obvious assumption. But if we say equality is supposed to be something that women have equally with men, it immediately falls apart because men are not equal. Trump is not at all equal to someone living in a very poor neighborhood who has no education and doesn't have $400 million from his father to help him build an empire to go bankrupt. Okay. Clearly men are not equal. Again, this is equal in terms of the idea of gender and humanity in culture, not equal just before the law. Arguably, they're not equal before the law either because how they get treated is often a bit different, but that's an abstract idea. In culture, men are not equal. So how could we just get women to be equal with men? And what would that look like? Another way to phrase this is to say that equal rights, which people are supposed to have, doesn't mean that domination or systems of domination have been eradicated. By domination, again, it's that hierarchy of some people at the top and some people at the bottom. Just because people have greater equality of rights does not mean that there's not systematic discrimination going on right now. And that in and of itself is kind of a big conceptual, oh, I understand now. Okay, I move that while they say we're equal, in practice, it doesn't work out that way. We see this perpetuation of the systems of domination with mainstream feminism that perceived one of the main goals to be getting women out into the workforce And by providing women with economic means of their own, which I'm all for, an economic means of their own, they could then free themselves from abusive relationships or dependency on men, all kinds of things. Get women working. But what mainstream feminism failed to realize is that there were millions of women already working, poor jobs, menial labor, however you want to define menial, and their perception, mainstream feminism, the perception was we should get high class or high paying wage jobs. The vision for mainstream feminism wasn't just to have employment. It wasn't just to have money. There was already employment and money to be had. It was to have what men already had in terms of the best or the better. So there were a number of assumptions in that. If this is true, and again we're generalizing, but if this is true, then simply getting women out of the home and getting an economic advantage or independence, it wasn't the sole story. It was a certain kind of economic advantage to give them independence. I think of it this way. Many men had been living slavishly to the corporate overlords for years. They didn't find their jobs fulfilling. They were climbing the corporate ladder because they were told to climb the corporate ladder. And these particular jobs were not meaningless because they were able to provide for their families and have some sort of sense of independence. But in servitude to these capitalist overlords again, they lose a part of themselves. And now women were fighting to be in a similar position. Again, I'm really overgeneralizing. Not for fulfilling jobs, just high-paying jobs. One of the interesting things that happens with capitalism is that big businesses are not really into charity. So if a large cohort of women are now socially required to be getting high-paying jobs, these businesses are not going to be creating new high-powered jobs. There's only one CEO, and if you're expecting every CEO position to now be 50% filled with women, they're not creating a whole bunch of new CEO jobs. The men that are in them are going to be out. Okay. But the larger problem is that as women climb these ladders, the people who are there are pushed down a rung. It's exclusionary. Whether it's a man or a woman or other climbing these ladders, the point is, as you go up the pyramid, the hierarchy, they're not creating more jobs because then they would lose profit. So there's a reshuffling of the deck. Is the deck being reshuffled equally between men and women? Arguably, yes. But only if it's white people or middle-class white people might that reshuffling be considered evil. It's evil, ooh, that's a Freudian slip. But when you look at the much larger picture of other genders and the poor especially, things weren't made better there at all, at the bottom of the pyramid. If anything, things were made worse. Hooks wants us to imagine a new kind of feminism, and she offers some interesting ideas. We'll consider them briefly in turn. First, that feminism should be a movement without an enemy. I find this view particularly attractive. If mainstream feminism was successful by making men an enemy, that's also part of its failure, because it's perpetuating, to the extent that it did this, it's perpetuating that victimization cycle where one kind of human needs to be pushed down so that others can be raised up. Let's just do away with that. I should not be picking on Trump for his sexist, misogynistic, dangerous views of women. I should be calling him out for those views, and I should be challenging him to rethink those views, and I should be saying that I'm not okay with those, and I should be quite vocal about it. But I should not be wishing harm on him. I should not be perceiving him as someone I need to tear down. If anything, he's someone who needs to be re-educated. He needs someone to sit down with him and explain to him that women are not just X, Y, or Z. Of course, that's incredibly difficult, and the idea that he in his 70s would change his mindset seems entirely unlikely. But if I allow myself to begin to hate and want to tear him down, then my movement cannot be sustained. It'll just lead to further intellectual violence or actual physical violence, and it's not something helpful. Don't privilege one gender over another. Don't privilege, that just to think about that. Don't privilege one economic group over another. The very system itself, how we operate society, privileges the rich. If we go a little further, we can argue that to even point out mainstream feminism as largely a failure, because it represented a very biased, selective group of people, that too might be perceived as me making, or in this case, Hooks making middle-class white women the enemy. That too must be resisted. We don't want to compound the issue and make things different. People have a hard time getting along when they're always fighting. And that's part of the issue. Fight, 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 anger, 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 hostility. It never seems to end. 2, feminism needs leaders, not rulers. Again, the stereotypical male is that bravado, my way or the highway, do what I tell you, I'm in charge, I'm the man. Is that what we want? That's certainly what we see in business, that competitive cutthroat in business, where if someone is going to genuinely win and make lots of money, others need to lose at least a little bit. There's an exploitation that's inherent in the system. That doesn't work. To have a ruler that is unaccountable to other people makes things so difficult, very difficult. So we need leaders to inspire us. We don't need women to become more aggressive like men. We don't to lead us. We don't need men to become something they're not either. We can all find in some respect an inspiration or role model in a leader who is accountable to people, not just listening to people, but genuinely relationally accountable, like I am to my family. I'm not in a position of hierarchy where I say, this is the way it is, and that's it. It just wouldn't work. It doesn't work that way. So too in the real world. This plays into the weird stereotype in which if you want to be successful as a woman in the job, in the workplace, you need to become more aggressive like a man. The only thing holding you back is that you're not aggressive, you're not assertive enough. You need to become that ruler-esque, you need to become that aggressive, macho person. I'm not sure how well that actually serves us, these assumptions. In fact, I'm pretty sure that assumption doesn't serve us very well at all. Women shouldn't feel forced to become men to compete in this weird world. Likewise, men, I'm speaking again from my own experience, shouldn't feel compelled to become these aggressive, competitive, machismo, tough guys. I've seen it my whole life, this idea of competition being instilled within us, that if you don't sink the basketball, if you're not good at sports, competitive things, if you're not the alpha dog, then you're somehow of less value. That doesn't inspire followers. That inspires obedience. That inspires, it's a chilling effect on human relationships. What about love? Oh, I know it sounds so fluffy, but what about love? What if we perceive or think of not the quintessential Trump, right? Competitive, cutthroat. You would not describe him as, at least in his leadership style, loving. What if we conceive of a genuine leader as someone who genuinely cares? That you can see it in their lives, that they have a history of caring for the community, that they're involved, that they have compassion, they feel pity, they sense with the culture when the culture hurts, and they do everything they can to heal it. That's love. Okay, we do this stereotype for the stereotypical mother, right? The love over her children, where she's not lord and master over her children. She sees her children, in this case, we could just say a community in general, and tries to meet those needs as a caring human being, not a ruler. I definitely think there's something to that. This would, of course, challenge our political structures and how we set up democracies. I don't know if you watched the debate with Hillary Clinton and Trump, and he would just walk around the stage like a lumbering. He was later described as a great ape or something, like as if that was a wonderful thing. And Hillary was articulate and clear, clever, smart. And a number of people watched these debates thinking that somehow Trump had won. Although in On every cognitive count, he failed in terms of his reasoning, his argumentation, his experience. He had no experience in politics. His policies were terrible. All of these things, not even close to what Hillary was accomplishing. But because he came across as whatever this is, people gravitated towards that. That's silly. That's just silly. And we've seen over the last number of years, utterly ineffective. 3, feminism needs to have some sense of solidarity against oppression. How do you bring so many different groups of women together and men together? How do you bring people together on an issue as diverse as domination and exploitation, sexism and oppression? I mean, there's so many ways to look at this. And it's pretty clear, I think, as a good idea in Hooks, to focus on poverty. Why? And this is something that traditional feminism has really failed to do. The reason is by focusing on poverty is something that affects us all. It's a real issue for everyone. And it's not a bipartisan issue. It's not a white or black person. It's an everybody issue. My mother was poor. Black women in this context have often been poor. And so we can unite us all, not by just fighting for black rights or just fighting for white women's middle class rights or whatever. Focus on poverty, it brings everyone together, and we can find the solidarity or the commonality needed to do something. Oh, and by the way, as Hooks points out, we're going to have to change society. We are going to have to fundamentally change how society works to correct poverty. You will find this as a common theme among a number of scholars who realize that the system as it is, I keep saying this system, but capitalism, business, neoliberalism, or the rich keep getting richer and the poor keep getting poorer. Honestly, the only way to change that, they believe, is a fundamental overhaul. There are other options. It just sometimes it takes a little bit of imagination. To go back to my first question, can men be feminists? What is feminism in the modern age? I think Hooks offers us a number of interesting insights into the challenges faced by feminists today in terms of the capitalist exploitation, the perpetuation of systems of domination that we don't think are there, but in fact are there. The further indoctrination of a whole group of women, middle-class white women largely, push them into the workforce. Did that mean that they were somehow more equal and that they had more power? Or were they too just part of the system now, like men had been for a very long time? And at the same time, did that mean that a large segment of society, women in society, were just pushed further down the economic system? Can men be feminists? Absolutely. Are you against oppression? Are you against systems of domination? Do you find people like Trump unacceptable and creepy in their dehumanization and using of other people? Then, hey, maybe you could be a feminist. Race, gender, class. Race, concerned with color of skin. Gender, obviously the feminine, male, female, other. And then class, issues of poverty. If you're interested in these, guess what? Maybe you want to call yourself a feminist. Maybe you want a whole different term. Maybe you don't like the word feminist, and that's fine too. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the take-home message for me is that whatever feminism is, it cannot be the normalization of dehumanization. Wollstonecraft and Hooks give me a lot to think about. I'm a man. Can I be a feminist? I think based on what they're saying, absolutely I can be a feminist. I can be a feminist. I'm against oppression. I'm against systems of domination. I'm against exploitation. I'm against the dehumanization of people by people like Trump, whether it's against women specifically or people of different color. I'm against poverty. There's more than enough wealth in the world right now. If we redistribute things equally, it would be a forced redistribution that people who cannot afford food right now can eat well. We can do this if we decided to do it as a culture. Going forward, what will feminism look like? I think it'll look a lot like what Hooks has in mind here. We will need to learn to have leaders that inspire us, mentors in a way, and to learn to do away with the ruler as someone who will save us. They may sound tough, they may sound strong, But ultimately, they don't save us. They make things more divisive. They make things more violent and reactionary. So I think the future of feminism and equality more generally will look something like what she has in mind, where we will find people or have people who are loving and caring. And that is the key mark of leadership. And I hope that we will find more meaningful employment and jobs along the way, and that we simply won't try to climb the corporate ladder for the sake of climbing the corporate ladder, and then also to give in to the stereotypical male traits that climbing the ladder requires. I hope my boys, when they're men, will have realized some of these principles, that they will have learned to challenge their assumptions about femininity, and that they will find a way around the boys will be boys mentality, and learn to cherish people, regardless of gender, skin color, and economic class. But that will require a tremendous amount of work to revise the system, to rethink the system for what it is. And that will be the future of feminism.